The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
Now, I think there is a risk that oil investors are underestimating the risk involved. The kind of strawman scenario of this has to be really bad until Iran closing off the Strait of Hormuz is slightly misleading because Iran could do all kinds of small disturbance, like using its drones, using its boats to affect the export channel by those oil tankers. Even as there's a credible risk that even a small scale of effort on Iran's behalf to try to disrupt the oil trade, disrupt the oil routes, would be bringing significant risk to the oil market. That's not being priced in right now.
The crisis in the Middle East has widened to a new and more perilous front. On Friday, June 13th, Israel launched a series of strikes on Iran, seeking to eliminate what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly decried as existential threats posed by ballistic missiles and what he claims is a rising nuclear weapons program. The initial attack, employing both conventional firepower and espionage, struck around 100 sites, according to Israel's military, killing top military commanders. Iran has responded with its own barrage, and the two nations continue to trade attacks. What once seemed a glimmer of hope that the United States could broker some kind of de-escalatory pact in the region now lies in ruins. What the outbreak of hostility means for the two nations, the region, and the world at large is the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate with Breakingviews columnists around the world. I'm your host, Jonathan Guilford. After years of threats, escalating, and subsiding tensions under a series of US administrations and against the backdrop of a worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Netanyahu has tried to strike a decisive blow. He claims that the White House was forewarned of the move, while US officials say that President Donald Trump vetoed a direct attempt to kill Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Iran occupies strategically crucial territory, in particular projecting influence over the Strait of Hormuz, the conduit for oil shipments equivalent to a fifth of the world's daily consumption of crude. As the conflict proceeds, the effects could be substantial. George Hay, Breakingviews editor for Europe and the Middle East, and Yawen Chen, an energy columnist based in London, are with me to discuss the situation. George, Yawen, welcome to the Viewsroom.
Hi there.
Thanks for having us.
George, maybe it's best to just start with an explanation of what exactly is happening. What was the status quo ante heading into Friday? Is this part of a pattern of escalating brinksmanship?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, it goes back to October the 7th in 2023, the attacks then by Hamas, which killed 1,200 people in Israel. And at that moment, I remember it was obviously a tremendous shock. But one of the key things that came out of that immediately was there was a good chance that there would be some kind of confrontation between Israel and Iran. And the reason for that is that Hamas and a number of other groups in the Middle East are widely seen as proxies of Iran. And so it was seen as an attack, however, indirectly, an attack by kind of Iran on Israel. And what's happened since then is we've had obviously the kind of ongoing war in Gaza, but we've also had confrontations between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, another proxy, and that built last year in April and October. There were two actual kind of unprecedented direct attacks by Iran on Israel in response to Israel killing some of the leaders of these proxies. And so that has kind of been going along for, some time now. But the reason why the latest incident started on Friday, Thursday, Friday, the reason why that's was still seen as a surprise is it had looked of late that if anything, we were moving towards some kind of deal between Iran and the US. Now, the whole thing with Iran is always that, and the reason why Israel is often so concerned about what it's doing is it's perpetually somewhere near or on the brink of building up towards getting a nuclear bomb. And the whole strategy for various administrations of the US was to try and kind of stop that happening. Um, and Donald Trump, the US president, it wasn't obvious, but it looked like they were kind of heading towards some kind of deal which would have resolved that to everyone's satisfaction. So what's happened now is that Prime Minister Netanyahu signed off on Thursday, Friday, a huge strike on Iran, which is a massive escalation on what we've seen before, and it's killed a number of senior military figures in Iran. And what he's trying to do is, it looks like, just kind of solve this problem for them once and for all, and remove their nuclear capability. And the question is whether this is actually what's going to happen.
Right. And I mean, to be clear, obviously, we should probably say up front, Iran denies Israel's characterization of its civilian nuclear program. This has been an object of negotiation, like the degree to which that program is allowed to develop, as you say, between the US administration and Iran for many years. I think the important thing to keep in mind here is what you're saying, right? That this is interlinked with a lot of other things happening in the region. This is not just some straightforward conflict happening in a delimited zone between two conventional forces. This is something that widens out to the entire region. Like you say, people see linkages between Hamas, which operates in the Gaza Strip, which obviously that has been the site of a massive Israeli military campaign over the past year. There are linkages to, as you say, Hezbollah. We have various crises in the region, including in Syria, among the Houthis. Like, can you just step me through just very quickly and simply kind of like what those linkages are, and maybe we can get into like what that implies for how wide this crisis could become?
Well, yeah, Iran had this strategy for dealing with Israel, or dealing with what it perceives as a threat of Israel. This strategy called a ring of fire, and that basically meant encircling Israel with these proxies, one of which is Hamas, one of which is Hezbollah. They're also aligned with the Houthis in Yemen, and they have various links with Syria and links with Iraq. So you have all these different groups in those regions, in those areas, and they're usually seen as proxies or Iran aligned. And the whole point is, for a long period of time, up to quite recently, you'd often see, obviously the Houthis were doing what they were doing in the Red Sea. They were kind of disrupting shipping there. But before that, they were, proxies for Iran were linked with various acts of sabotage in the Arabian Gulf, and all sorts of things, all sorts of kind of mini conflicts. And they were never actually wars. And Iran tended not to kind of say, yes, these groups are linked to us, but it was always this kind of like proxy war going on in the background. Now, actually, what's happened now is a lot of the leadership of these big these proxies, in particular Hezbollah, a lot of those senior leaders have been killed by Israel over the last 18 months. And the perception is this ring of fire, this strategy is on behalf of Iran is a lot weaker than it was. And so actually, despite the fact that there's always been this kind of indirect hostility between Israel and Iran in the last however many years, what's actually now happening, almost kind of for the first time, is a really direct face-off between the two of them. And that's why it feels so different, and it's also why it's so concerning.
Right. And Johan, I'd love to pull you in here because that explanation of how all these forces are acting in concert makes it seem like it's I hesitate to say equilibrium, but a kind of system of alliances and so on that is now moving into disequilibrium that promises perhaps escalating violence going forward. And yet the market reaction we've seen thus far has been pretty subdued, right? The move in the price of oil has been notable, but not historically large. Global indices like the S&P 500 continue to climb. Why do you both think the world seems more complacent now than, say, following the invasion of Ukraine?
I think the oil market has traditionally been a market where investors adopt this seeing is believing attitude. So you can probably trace back to when Israel first launched the war in Gaza. I don't think oil investors were too agitated just because it doesn't really directly apply. It doesn't affect directly any oil flows. Israel that is not a major oil producer. As long as Iran is not dragged in, I think there's a big shrugging of this on their behalf. But as George has mentioned, this is really a milestone that has, for the first time, seen a direct involvement targeting Iran. And I think that's why you see oil prices went up 7% on Friday. But over the weekend, there's a notable restraint where Iran's export facility, which basically exports 90% of its oil, wasn't affected. And I think there is a concerted effort. You can see it from either OPEC hiking their output, even in the previous few weeks. And there is a clear preference for Trump to maintain the oil prices relatively low. So there's some kind of restraint so far to not affect global oil flow as much as possible. Now, I think there is a risk that oil investors are underestimating the risk involved. So I think the kind of strawman scenario of this has to be really bad until Iran closing off the Strait of Hormuz is slightly misleading because Iran could do all kinds of small disturbance, like using its drones, using its boats to um, to affect the export channel by those oil tankers. So I think even as there's a credible risk that even a small scale of effort on Iran's behalf to try to disrupt the oil trades, disrupt the oil routes, will be bringing significant risk to oil market that's not being priced in right now.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd add to that is just on the face of it, there's something really weird about where we are because in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, people were freaking out about the idea that Russia would be sanctioned and then its oil wouldn't go onto the market, which didn't quite work out in so many words. But the point was that was probably somewhere around 5% of the global oil consumption, is about 100 million barrels a day. That was roughly about 5% of that, and the market freaked out and went up to $120 dollars a barrel. Like what we're talking about here, what Johan was mentioning, the Strait of Hormuz, literally 20% of the oil and products market goes through there every day, like around 20 million barrels a day. So that's a lot more. And so on the face of it, the name of the game here is trying to work out what's going on with the oil market and how it's going to affect it. This is what kind of level of probability are people ascribing, oil traders ascribing to the idea that that Strait of Hormuz would get blocked and nothing can come out of it. It's clearly if that did happen, then the oil market would, you'd expect it to go to 150, 200. I mean, who knows? But it would definitely go up miles more than what's actually been the case so far. And that's
One
kind of the
thing
interesting thing.
One thing I am curious about on that is, as somebody who is a layman in this area, like I hear a lot about concerns about the Strait of Hormuz specifically and about logistics. To what degree is Iran itself integrated with the global oil market? Because it is a substantial producer, right? Like, is this is it, is the nature of its relationship to the rest of the global market such that this isn't something that affects the price in kind of like a one-to-one way like it would be if, say, Saudi Arabia stopped producing oil? Is it more of a logistical question because of that?
Yeah, so Iran itself produces about 3.5 million barrels a day, and it exports about 1.8, mostly to China. Um, so right now, even the attacks on the domestic front is not affecting that supply much, from what I understand. Like even though there is a targeted attempt to shut down the gas production and everything for domestic use, I don't think it's affecting export supply. And then on the next level up, you have the regional infrastructure that Iran could attack, right? It could attack Saudi pipelines or facilities like it did in 2019, which would be a leg up on the escalation run, and it will cause a further spike. And then the third run of that picture is it started trying to using drones and boats and even getting the Houthis to affect all the trade flow on the Strait of Hormuz. So it doesn't really have to fully close the strait, but even if it goes through that escalation run, you can start seeing people getting more panic about it.
Yeah, that's a crucial point, and I think that's kind of one of the explanations for why um, what's going on at the moment. I think people are potentially um, looking at this situation and going, well, A, the Strait of Hormuz is not shut, and B, it's hardly in Iran's interest to do that because then it wouldn't be able to sell any oil to China, or it wouldn't be able to get the oil to China. Um, Both of which are true. It's just there's quite a lot of different, between that and just de-escalation. There's all sorts of things that could happen, such as what Yarwin's pointing out there. Just as you know, I mean, the Houthis, who are the Iran-aligned rebels who are in Yemen, they've spent a lot of the last year incredibly effectively blocking the Red Sea, which to the extent that a lot of trade just goes around Africa now because it doesn't want to get hit by Houthi rockets. Now, you know, it's it's far from impossible that they plus Iran, you know, target stuff in going through the Arabian Gulf, and that would be very problematic for the oil market.
And I should explain a little bit OPEC stabilizing role here as well. So the reason why earlier this year that oil market was extremely calm, and even you see prices hitting $60 a barrel lows, is because OPEC Plus, including Russia, they've been sitting on maybe 5-6 million barrels a day of spare capacity. They've been basically restraining the output in order to prop up the market for the last 2 years. And you're seeing that effort being rewinded a little bit now. So, with that kind of capacity, you can imagine if Iran suddenly stopped exporting its oil, there is a way, or even like the regional infrastructure, say the Saudi pipelines are being attacked, there is a way for all these other members, OPEC members, mainly shouldered by Saudi Arabia, to kind of restore that capacity or get the oil out to offset the kind of shortage out there. The problem is really with the possible closure or like attacks on the Strait of Hormuz itself, because countries like Saudi Arabia, they have no alternative route. They have to use the strait to get their oil out. So this is where things get tricky. You can easily have a big spike if that happens. You see more random attacks by Iran, but then at the same time, it's also possible that by that point, the U.S. Army or military have no choice but getting involved, because this is starting to affect oil prices on a greater scale, and then it's kind of hard to say what's the end game from there.
Right. This is what I wonder, and this is perhaps an unanswerable question, but I'm going to try it anyway. What are the possible things we could be looking for that could happen next here? I realize we're in a febrile moment, and it's unclear whether escalation is just going to continue to spiral, and the US is playing a complicated role from Trump having previously pushed for an agreement, as we said, after tearing up an agreement signed by his predecessor, Barack Obama, years ago. It's to say that there are a lot of moving pieces is obviously an understatement. I mean, is there a sense of what we should be looking to for a guidepost on where this is headed?
Yeah, I mean, at one end of the spectrum, you could say, okay, well, this all that's happened in the last uh, few days since Thursday, Friday is just like a massive kind of form of leverage in order to kind of shove Iran towards some kind of deal um, in which there's kind of various curbs on what they do with their nuclear capabilities. Um, you could kind of make an argument for saying uh, that is what may end up happening if you assume that like the Iranian um, leaders and military leaders have been grievously weakened both by these attacks and previous attacks. The Iranian economy is not very strong. Um, if they've been kind of chastened into feeling they need to have a deal, then a deal may indeed be what happens. But there are at the other end of the spectrum, you could equally look at this and say, well, there's various things floating around about the idea that there would be regime change. Regime change could be a kind of outcome of this in Iran, and the danger with that is that um, if Iran has a choice between saying, oh, actually, well, maybe we um, don't or aren't able to kind of export our oil to China versus like literally not being around anymore because the regime has been changed. That may encourage them to just escalate further, and that takes us into all sorts of uncharted territory. It takes us into the likelihood that they might step up attacks in the Arabian Gulf on shipping. Um, it they may try and fast forward their whatever nuclear capability they have. Um, that's very destabilizing, and at the end of that, it's quite difficult to say that you can easily get a deal in that situation. Now, we don't know which end of the spectrum or where on that spectrum things will pan out, but that in itself is concerning.
Right. Yes, no, absolutely. Okay, well, on that note, I think this is a good place to wrap it up. George, Yoan, thank you so much for joining me on the Viewsroom.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Cheryl Pena in New York and Gregory Garner in Toronto. You can listen to a new episode of the Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow the Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.